together with my colleague, research fellow from US program, Marianne, she will somehow offer the US perspective in terms of to what extent and she would consider are the pressing issues and why America would like to launch this technology war towards China. So Marianne, perhaps you could tell me some key elements on this research paper and research funding we found so far.
So yes, particularly again from the US perspective, there is a number of concerns that the Trump administration has raised with regards to trade, but as you mentioned, also technology. And from the perspective of President Trump in particular, he is very much concerned with the US's trade deficit with China. However, I think that focus is a bit misplaced for two reasons. First of all, it ignores that the US actually has a trade surplus when it comes to services with China. And then also, it is very much focusing on the bilateral element of the relation. Yes, overall global trade imbalances matter, but trade policy really doesn't get to the heart of it, because what's really driving those global imbalances is macroeconomic forces such as savings and investments. So again, that focus on the trade deficit, I think, is misplaced. Another concern that the Trump administration has raised is China's alleged currency manipulation. Here we saw the US Treasury Department announce formally that China is a currency manipulator. That was in August of this year. Most experts and also the International Monetary Fund very much disagree with that assessment and deem that China is currently not manipulating its currency. And then again, another perhaps much more structural element of the US's concerns are China's non-market practices and policies. And a key driver here is overcapacity in the steel sector. That is primarily because of domestic subsidies and state-owned enterprises that operate in China. And the result is that global markets are being flooded with cheap steel. And again, those concerns are not just concerns raised by the US. Those are very much shared by the US's allies around the world. However, some of the US actions, again, have caused a backlash, and we can get into that later. But again, from the concerns as well, the other issues are very much China's practices and policies when it comes to forced technology transfer, intellectual property theft, and other broader issues that are related very much to China's quest to become a leader on the technology front.
So we agree on the current level of trade war. It could be divided into three elements. The first element is based on tariffs. And the second element is about market access, about market economy status of China. But the very last one, it is about China's particular economic structure, which alarmed the United States and also together with United States allies. Can we divide it into that three elements of it?
I think there's three elements, but I would very much stress that they are not just in silos.
Sure.
They are very much overlapping and intertwined. Exactly.
Okay.
So I think what we're really seeing is that this dispute goes beyond the tit-for-tat tariffs, but it is much more about the technological elements and a quest for supremacy in the technology space.
Because currently within Trump's administration, they view technology development is something rather static, something not moving forward, and therefore can only be monopolized by the United States and its allies. So for example, to letting countries like China somehow own a certain technology, and for Trump's administration, they would consider it's almost become a national security threat. Would you consider so?
I think that's very much the case, that again, the elements of technology, trade, and issues of national security are very much linked. And that is also because many of the technological developments that we're seeing are for dual-use goods. So they can essentially function for multiple purposes. And that, I think, is very much one of the key drivers of this. But there is also a larger question around, again, the quest for dominance and kind of great power, strategic competition that we're seeing play out between the United States and China at the moment. And again, that also has implications for other countries and regions of the world. And they're very much, on the one hand, on the sidelines of this, but at the very same time, a part of it, and again, many of the US's concerns are shared by the US's allies, such as the EU, such as Japan. There is a US-EU-Japan trilateral grouping that is very much looking at how to best address those shared concerns vis-à-vis China when it comes to technology. But that does also spill over into reform efforts for the World Trade Organization, for example, because the international institutions haven't kept up with the pace of technological change and also the changing economic dynamics. So to some extent, it is also the issue that the international institutions are no longer fit for purpose. And I think that is another element that we're seeing play out. Again, there are efforts to adapt that. If you actually update the World Trade Organization, for example, update the rules to deal with issues around, again, China's state-owned enterprises, intellectual property theft, forced technology transfer, I think that would be very much one way to come to a potential, not necessarily resolution of the US-China trade and tech standoff, but again, to come to a resolution of the tensions that we're seeing and to upgrade the international space that we're operating in.
I mean, from my research throughout that paper, one thing what I found, it is not just about technology itself. It is also about technology standard. In the future, which country would own that particular technology standard, and somehow posing a challenge, not just for the countries, but also for the companies who are interested in getting into both American market and also the Chinese market. I mean, one thing which I've noticed is, since Xi Jinping came to power, and this entire notion of the so-called discursive power, the courage for letting China to join the international debate from the very beginning. So in building new institutions, in building new standards, and somehow what I realized also in the technology space, and that standard setting competition become ever intense between China and United States. I mean, it's almost like, once you have a Washington consensus-based institution building standard setting, whereas on the other hand, the Chinese is somehow trying to establishing something, a parallel. And then that sense of parallel somehow, as what you said earlier, to make the medium range powers and also the companies who are interested in both market have to take a stance, and where are they going to side? So these are the things which I found, it's not just technology itself, but it's also about a standard, and how are we going to accustom to certain standards? Are we going to either having your way or Huawei, those kind of things.
But how realistic do you think it is for China to realize those ambitions, particularly in an environment where perhaps other countries very much have suspicions about China's, given the political system, given concerns about also political freedom, for example? What are the implications of that for actually, again, China's ability to become a leader on setting those global standards?
I think in order to surmount those challenges, I think China still has a long way to go, because firstly, we often believe that in the conventional wisdom, the greater personal liberty you enjoy in a particular society, the greater innovative power and that society would enjoy. Where, however, China has defied all that conventional wisdom, but only by using state intervention style of developing technology standard. It's not driven by market forces. So that would potentially pose a problem. You might have oversupply, oversubscription of certain technology and certain standards, which are not really led by market forces. So to what extent those utility could be applied for those technology standards in the global market? And that's the challenge number one for China. Number two is exactly what you have mentioned. If we are considering to have a leading force for global technology standard setting, it has to be a country with a due respect on the rule of law. And it has to have the country with a very clear and clean legal system in order to abide those standards has been set up. And I think so far, China is falling short behind that. So that's the reason number two. And the reason number three, again, this is really applied to, it's a demand and supply issue. It's very much like an internationalization of the currency. China may be able to provide those technology standards, which is China has the supply. But whether those technology standards can become internationalized, it has to be driven by the demand. And how many other foreign companies are willing to use the Chinese standards and how accustomed they are in order to use standards. I mean, it's a habit thing. It's a common knowledge. It's a common sense of habit thing of using particular standard. And I think so far China is still a long way to go for that one. Yeah.
Again, coming back also to the US's concerns, a lot is also driven by China's ambition behind the China Made in 2025 strategy.
Sure.
So to what extent do you think that is still a key kind of ambition for the Chinese leadership?
Let's start with the history of Made in China 2025. Made in China 2025 being proposed back to 2015 by the Ministry of Science and Technology to argue that China would be able to establish itself by 2025 to have 10 key industries to become the leading force at a global level. But however, this initiative has caused a lot of controversies within the Chinese government, within the Chinese administration, because firstly we felt we have not established a solid scientific research capability, for the basic scientific research capability in order to upgrade itself to achieve those leading, to be leading forces on those sectors. And secondly, in terms of budget, where are we going to distribute those budget? Are we going to exclusively focusing on that 10 industries and largely ignore the basic studies on physics and science and math? And perhaps not. And thirdly, this is also to do with China's past experience in terms of dealing with the Soviet Union back to late 1950, when suddenly the Soviet Union broke up with China and decided to withdraw all the foreign experts to helping China building its technology sector and even including nuclear sector. And China learned that lesson and very much cherished that whole sense of self-reliance. I think that sense of self-reliance and somehow inherited by Xi Jinping from his predecessors and persuaded him to launch this Made in China 2025. But this Made in China 2025 for me is a very successful political campaign domestically, but internationally this caused a lot of unnecessary fear. And China could actually easily conduct those initiatives without really pronouncing it, like many other countries have done in the past. But however, I think given where we are, the government realized there's a discrepancy between the rhetoric and the actual hard reality on the ground.
That's interesting. And again, I think that is one of the key drivers behind the US's and others' concerns. And again, a lot of the actions that we have seen by the United States, I think, can very much go back to that, but also the other issues that I've identified. And so in terms of the actions that we have seen, the US has introduced a variety of tariffs, 25% on steel, 10% on aluminum, all in the name of national security.
Sure.
Again, those are primarily targeted at China, but I think that they missed the mark because what they do is they're introduced globally with certain waivers, but they really hit primarily the US's allies, including the EU. In terms of other tariffs, again, primarily when it comes to technology, the US has introduced those so-called Section 301 tariffs. And those are, again, have been increased throughout 2018, 2019. China has responded with its own tariffs. We've also seen dispute settlement procedures launched at the World Trade Organization. So a lot of flurry on that front. And then also, I think one of the other elements has very much been screening foreign investment coming into the United States, where China isn't necessarily singled out in name, but again, driving a lot of the concerns. And again, in practice, you see that a lot of the increased scrutiny is being placed on investment coming from China, again, primarily because of national security considerations. And the so-called CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, it's an interagency committee that again scrutinizes foreign investment for national security considerations, has increased or has expanded its authority. So we've seen increased blockage and of again, foreign investment decisions.
So do you consider there's a tendency that US government has been using its domestic law and apply in the international space. I mean, clearly Section 301 is a very standard practice, and not just apply for China, but apply to many other countries in the world. So would you see there's a past dependence happen with the United States by using domestic law and apply an international space when it comes to trade practice?
Well, I think the key consideration is here particularly to what extent, again, those measures are aimed at China primarily, or it's in an international space where, yes, China is a target, but eventually there's unintended consequences of hitting other countries and key allies of the United States. There is a large question around, again, are those measures that the United States has taken, particularly those tariffs, in the name of national security, are they consistent with the United States obligations under WTO?
Sure.
So that is a key question, hasn't been resolved. And also domestically, there has been a lot of pushing back against those tariff measures, because again, there is questions around, is this really in the name of national security? But also around, traditionally, it's actually Congress that has the authority to regulate commerce with foreign nations. And over time, that has been, shifted primarily to the executive. But you are seeing efforts within Congress to kind of claw back that authority. So it is also very much playing out domestically. Business community, again, very much greatly concerned about China's policies and practice, but very much concerned about the US's actions and rhetoric, because essentially what it's leading to is that the tariffs are raising costs for business, but also domestic consumers.
Exactly, even if they are concerned, and I don't think the American companies are willing to give up the Chinese domestic market. So even if under the persuasion of President Trump, that is not happening.
Exactly. And parts within the administration are also very much pushing for a decoupling from China, so severing all trade, capital, and technology flows. And I think it's very
and
unlikely.
Also people as well.
Exactly. Not to forget about individuals and peoples. But really, what again is my concern is that these efforts in the United States to decouple, they're not going to be successful. So what could a potential successful strategy look like?
Sure.
I think it would have to very much focus on increasing the US's own competitiveness.
Exactly.
Because, again, it's easy to just blame China's unfair trade and technology practices, but to some extent it's also very much due to China's market size and private and public capital.
Exactly.
So the US really has to get, I think, its own house in order, focus on education, immigration reform. And the other part is also very much, again, working with those international allies that share the US's concerns, building on the US-EU-Japan trilateral that I mentioned earlier, and also using this as an opportunity to reform the international institutions, make them fit for purpose. And I think that could not only put pressure on China to reform its policies and practices, but also, again, looking forward, upgrading the international system and the rules-based international order.
I entirely agree with you. I mean, this entire debate on, to what extent a government should play a role in terms of determining drive technology development. I mean, both the United States and China are sitting at the end of two spectrum. That entire debate on where are we placing the role of market and where are we placing the role of government. And that also would largely apply for technology sector as well. So that debate of Keynes and Frederick Hayek and still continues and would even apply for the trade war nowadays. So yeah, that's a very, very interesting to look into.